Good afternoon. This is a great group, and we're going to have an excellent lecture. It's too bad that he's not prepared, really, to talk on this topic, but we'll learn more about our speaker's background in just a few minutes. I'm Harriet Hemasi. I'm Dean of the Library, and it's a pleasure to have each and every one of you with us tonight as part of the Ellen Catherine Gstalder Memorial Lecture. This annual lecture was established by Ellen's parents and family to honor her life and her unwavering commitment to social justice. Ellen graduated from Georgetown College in 1998 and soon thereafter joined Teach for America. She was assigned to Orr Elementary School in Anacostia. Many of you will know that at that time, Orr was a completely segregated school, with Ellen being the only person in the school who was not African American. During her years at Orr, Ellen witnessed many forms of social injustice and inequality. She saw firsthand the results of structural racism. It wasn't called that back then. But there was gross underfunding and slighting of this elementary school and the precious lives that it was intended to shape and inspire. Orr was a school without enough teachers, a school that had 18 months or longer wait for any kind of special education support, a school with only one phone in the entire building, hard to imagine today, and a school with a lunch program consisting of totally inadequate nutrition. Ellen wanted and expected more for this school and these children and others in similar situations. Her determination to make a difference was monumental. Even after experiencing a period of devastating sickness, Ellen began working on a professional chef's certificate at the Institute of Culinary Education in New York. She dreamed of changing the nutrition available to public school students everywhere and had been accepted into the NYU Master's program in public health education. Ellen's goals and life were filled with ambition and compassion. We're so grateful to the Gstalder family's commitment to sharing and celebrating Ellen's memory, and to their commitment to keeping Ellen's beautiful spirit alive. Please join me in recognizing and thanking members of the family that are here with us tonight. I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Andrew Schoenholtz, a Georgetown law professor who will talk with us about the challenges and complexities of refugees at the border during humanitarian crises. He is, of course, very well prepared for his talk tonight. Dr. Schoenholtz co-directs the Center for Applied Legal Studies and directs the certificate program in refugees and humanitarian emergencies. In addition, he serves as the faculty director of the Human Rights Institute and oversees Georgetown's Asylum Advocacy Volunteer Assistance Project. Prior to his work at Georgetown, Andy Schoenholtz served as deputy director of the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform. He has practiced immigration, asylum, and international law, and also conducted numerous fact-finding missions around the world to study the root causes of forced migration, refugee protection, and long-term solutions to mass migration emergencies and humanitarian relief operations. Please join me in welcoming Andy Schoenholtz.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Harriet's the Dean of the Library. Really appreciate the invitation to speak today. I want to thank Kathleen as well and everybody else who's set this beautiful library up today for our talk. And of course, I want to particularly thank Herb and Barbara Gstalder for setting up this memorial lecture series. And I'm just deeply honored to be talking today about the challenging issues of social justice that I have no doubt Ellen would have been very concerned about. So thank you so much for welcoming me here. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to start with presenting you with some information about who is seeking asylum today globally and in this area, and why. And I want us to think a little bit about why are some of them coming to the United States, and in somewhat larger numbers than they have in the past, right? I then want to turn to some history. Why and how did Congress establish the asylum system that we have in place right now? I also want to look a little bit about how the laws changed since the 1980 Refugee Act, when it was first created, by different Congresses in the Clinton administration and then the second Bush administration. I will talk a little bit about how the Trump administration tried to shut down asylum at the US-Mexico border, and how the current administration, the Biden administration, has responded to significant arrivals at the southern border. And I'll close with some ideas about how I think the United States can and should respond to the current humanitarian crisis. So let's start with who's seeking asylum around the world, and why did they leave their countries to do this, right? The UN tells us that there are over 108 million children, women, and men who are currently displaced due to a variety of causes: persecution, conflict, serious violence, and other humanitarian issues. Most stay within the territory of their country. They are internal refugees. They're internally displaced. They have not crossed an international border, for the most part. But not an insignificant number have crossed an international border to seek safety. And among these forced migrants are about 27 million refugees. 21 million of those 27 million are under the protection mandate of the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. You may have heard of them. And about 6 million are supported by the UN Relief and Works Agency, right? And in addition to those 27 million refugees, there are about 5 million asylum seekers, people who haven't been determined yet to be refugees. Some of them are, some of them are not. We're going to talk about why. All refugees were once asylum seekers. If anybody's crossed an international border and have been recognized as refugees, they were once asylum seekers. They were seeking safety. Not all asylum seekers, though, are refugees, according to what we'll learn in a moment, is a relatively narrow international treaty definition of who a refugee is. So when we talk about refugees today, there are many different types of refugees, if you will, different causes, actually. There's refugees who are fleeing persecution, very serious harm, right? Often in connection with some characteristic of theirs that makes them a target. There are refugees who are fleeing conflict, oftentimes because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? They're fighting parties in their towns, and they got to get out of Dodge. They got to leave. And sometimes that means crossing a border. Sometimes it means staying internally. And there are too many examples around the world of refugees who've fled conflict. There are other types of serious violence other than conflict. that people flee, that become intolerable for them to live with. And now the newest group, and it's still early with this group, are the group that's crossing borders because of disasters, right, and climate change. There's a lot more to come on that. Let's look and see who's actually arriving at the U.S. southern border. I went to look at the Customs and Border Protection data on this. Our government does provide some pretty good data if you know where to look on the websites, right? And so from October 2023 through February 2024, so for that 5-month period, it's the most recent data we have, Customs and Border Protection officials have processed more than 1.1 million people at and in between ports of entry, right? Some have tried to enter at a port of entry, at a regular port, often land ports of entry, right? Generally land ports of entry. And some have come in between those ports of entry because that's where they arrived or that's where smugglers took them, right? In order to stay safe, they arrived there. Some 460,000 have arrived as families. I don't know what your image is of who's arriving, but it's fairly complicated. About 57,000 came as unaccompanied children, meaning they were not with a parent or an adult caregiver, right? The vast majority arriving at our southern border with Mexico are from countries in the Western Hemisphere. So they're from our region, the vast numbers. Yes, there are people coming from other regions as well. We still have people coming from China, from other parts of the world. But the largest numbers are coming from our region. So who is actually seeking asylum amongst this group? Well, many of them are fleeing humanitarian problems, and some of them will apply for asylum, but let's look at a few of the nationalities. Venezuelans. Why are the Venezuelans coming? Well, there's instability that's related to authoritarianism. Pretty much so. Some are targeted politically, but a lot of people, there's just a lot of instability that's coming out of the current leadership there. Cuba, no surprise. This has been going on for a long time with Cuba, right? Now, the latest there is actually the state economy is in turmoil following the pandemic. And so more and more people are trying to find another place to live. Haiti. I mean, this is a long time connection with the United States. We have many legal immigrants who've come from Haiti, and we've also had people who didn't have permission but had to flee, right? What's going on there? It's a failed state at this point. There's been political assassination. It looks like criminal gangs have control of anybody has control of the territory down there. Then Nicaragua, a classic in many ways, unfortunately, still a classic. You know, a regime that cracked down on political protesters, right? And there are other problems there as well, but a lot of the people fleeing were fleeing because they were oppositionists to the regime. I will just add that for those who do seek asylum, and we're going to come back to this, there's a great need for representation if they ultimately get into immigration court to make a claim, right? Many of them will find counsel, but many will not. Our system is not set up well to do that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But why the United States? We understand why they're leaving their home countries, but why did they come to the United States? Or are they still coming to the United States? There's a whole range of reasons. Most of you won't remember what former President Reagan used to say. He used to talk about refugees who were voting with their feet. I think of the Nicaraguans that way, if you will, right? They were fleeing an oppressive regime. Now, for President Reagan, it used to mean if you were fleeing a left-wing regime, you were voting with your feet, but you get the point, right? Some are coming simply because it's just not safe. Compared to their home countries and other alternatives, this is the safest place for them. Some of them are seeking certain freedoms that they didn't have in their own country and that the United States offers. We have a long history of something we all call the American dream. And for some people, you know, that's that's a draw. That's what brings him here. Think about how you would imagine what that means to some of these people. And again, there are particular nationalities who've been coming for many, many years. There's a long connection. And once the connections in the migration world begin, and this is true of the history of international migration everywhere, not just to the United States, once they begin, they don't just stop like that. The connection's been made, and so we continue to have Cubans and Haitians, as I've said, coming. The Venezuelans are actually really quite extraordinary in this sense, because they're coming a much further distance, right? And in fact, they started coming in the 1990s, late 1990s, when Chavez took over, arriving in much larger numbers recently. But most of the 7.7 million who have fled Venezuela, yeah, I'll say that again, 7.7 million have fled Venezuela. Most of them, under Maduro, they're in neighboring Colombia and nearby Peru, as well as in other South American countries. It's a smaller, much smaller group who are coming here. But we haven't seen them arriving in the numbers that they're arriving here. So they're coming here as well. Okay, let's now turn to what asylum system we have. Where did it come from? Why did Congress set it up, and how? This actually begins because of a failure. And it wasn't just the United States that failed. It was what we now call the international community that failed, and they failed during the Second World War to save refugees from Nazi persecution. Before and during the Second World War, the United States had no laws to rescue refugees from persecution. The international community did meet at a point when they might have saved some, for example, some Jews being persecuted by the Third Reich. They met in 1938 at the Evian Conference. It was not a success for a variety of reasons. The U.S. Congress considered a bill to save 20,000 Jewish children in 1939 and 1940 again. That bill failed. 20,000. It failed. After the Second World War, I would say that there were two major reasons that the international community decided that one of the first major human rights treaties that was needed was a refugee treaty. The first one was the Genocide Convention. This was the next one. It was negotiated in 1950 and 1951, and it was negotiated because the international powers at that time understood that the refugees actually destabilized the countries that they were fleeing to, and that wasn't healthy for those countries. And the reason they did was because of the human rights violations they were suffering in the countries that were persecuting them, right? So it both fulfilled sort of an international stability purpose, if you will, to have some sort of refugee system, some refugee laws, as well as, ensuring that, well, maybe states will live up to some of their human rights obligations. At least that's the idea. So when the European refugee problem didn't end after the Second World War, the international community negotiated a treaty to enable those, and there's a very particular definition of who a refugee was, who had a well-founded fear of persecution, which is very serious harm, in order to rebuild their lives in another country. And that persecution had to be in connection with something that effectively the reasons why the Nazis had persecuted a whole range of people, and then the Soviets were beginning to do some of this as well. So people were persecuted in connection with fundamental characteristics and belief, religion, race, nationality, political opinion. Those were the major ones at the time that they were focused on. It's not until 1980 that Congress then passes a Refugee Act. Senator Kennedy Ted Kennedy was one of the leaders in negotiating and getting that act through Congress. They adopted the new UN definition in this treaty, effectively, to protect persecuted refugees. The Attorney General of the United States then was ordered by the statute to establish a system to assess applications for protection by asylum seekers. And the statute made it clear that those who are granted asylum are on a pathway to citizenship. That is, if they follow the laws of the United States, they will become, 5 years later, eligible for citizenship, right? And in 1990, so a decade after this law is passed, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, you may have heard of INS. I don't know if the students have heard of INS, but others of us have. So that was the predecessor to the Department of Homeland Security, right? INS created the Asylum Office. It was a separate office. It was created with a mandate to protect refugees. Now, they had to figure out who was and who wasn't a refugee, right? It's one thing to have the mandate, then they had to do adjudications and figure that out. But they trained them seriously because they were committed to try to figure out who was a refugee who should be protected and offer safety in the United States. In the 1980s, we had very few asylum seekers coming. That was just the situation at the time. You can think of all the changes that have taken place since then that have made travel more possible. What connects us in this now smaller globe, if you will, right? All those things were not there in the 1980s. Smaller numbers came. Most of them were fleeing some communist countries in Europe. For the first 20 years after 1990, when the Asylum Office was adjudicating claims, most of the claims were made by people who came to the United States with a temporary visa, overstayed their visa, and applied for asylum. Some of them had managed to enter the United States without inspection. That's a pretty hard thing to do right now in the southern border because the southern border is much more securely controlled. There are lots of people coming, but it's actually hard to sneak by these days. That wasn't the case for many years. Only in 2014, so we're talking just a decade ago, did families, particularly women and children, start arriving in larger numbers from northern Central America. And I want to make one other important point about who's coming. During the last 4 decades, most of the asylum seekers have been people of color. Congress didn't stop in 1980. Some of you may recall that in the mid-1990s, there was a significant degree of what I think now is the beginnings of anti-immigrant sentiment in this country. And Congress passed a law in 1996 that established an expedited removal process at the border itself. So they wanted to speed up the processing right at the border. And initially, it largely applied at the ports of entry to who was coming at that time. Well, who was coming at the ports of entry largely, if you look at the southern border, were Mexicans who were coming to work in the United States. There's a very long history of Mexican immigration. It was often very circular when it was possible for it to be that way. And so there was demand for jobs here, right? And people would come and work. But the expedited removal process was applied to them if they didn't have permission to come into the United States. The Congress set up a special way to treat asylum seekers because if you're going to expedite the removal process right at the border, the goal was to make sure the United States complied with its international treaty obligations to protect refugees and its statutory obligations. That's what Congress created in 1980, the Refugee Act, which required that the United States protect refugees. So when the Clinton administration interpreted what is now called the credible fear screening, so just think of this as the sort of initial step. Somebody comes to the border, says that they're afraid to go home, and then they're interviewed by an asylum officer, and the asylum officer has to figure out, okay, do they have a credible fear of persecution in connection with one of these protected characteristics, and should we allow them to seek asylum in immigration court? That's the determination. The Clinton administration decided, first of all, there weren't that many people coming at the time who were seeking asylum, And they wanted to be sure that we didn't make mistakes. Mistakes are always going to be made. That's part of how things work. Adjudications are imperfect. But the goal was not to make mistakes. So they made this not a particularly difficult standard to meet, as long as you could show that you had what's called a reasonable possibility to demonstrate asylum, ultimately. Okay, started at the ports of entry under George W. Bush administration. It expanded to in between the ports of entry and about 100 miles away from the border. So this is when the southern border really expands to capture anybody coming over through this expedited removal process. And so this Bush II administration was the first one also to start detaining family asylum seekers. And they did that at private prisons in Texas and elsewhere. When the Obama administration came in, they decided they're not going to detain women and children anymore initially. And then more women and children arrived in 2014. Enough that the Obama administration decided, and I'm just being descriptive here, I'm not setting out any norms, right? Just describing what happened. They decided we're going to detain the families. And why were they arriving and starting in 2014? There was increased violence in the region, and some of them were coming to reunite with family members who were in the United States, right? Because we've never figured out what to do with people who've been here for a very long time. Sometimes they've had some legal status, sometimes they've been part of the undocumented population, and Congress has never resolved that issue. And so if they had young children, a 10-year-old girl or 11-year-old boy, that was the age the gangs were recruiting in Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And if you were the mother or father, you would probably be doing what those mothers and fathers did, which was, okay, try to bring them here, but you had no legal path to do that. Okay. Now, what was then Vice President Biden's important statement that he made to try to discourage these families coming to the United States? We're going to send, this is a quote, we're going to send the vast majority of you back. Once an individual's case is fully heard, and if he or she does not qualify for asylum, he or she will be removed from the United States and returned home. Everyone should know that we expect many of the recent migrants, I should say, to fall into this category. My guess is a vast majority, and they will be going home. As it turned out, most demonstrated that they had a credible fear, and then they were allowed to pursue their asylum claims in immigration court. Okay. The next administration, the Trump administration, as I said, actually tried very seriously to shut down asylum at the southern border. Now, why? Why was this such a huge issue? I don't know if any of you know the name Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller was the advisor to former President Trump. He was the real, not just idea person, but he was the advocate within the White House for all of the policies that were put into place. And why was he so focused on this issue? Because asylum leads to U.S. citizenship. And he didn't want that more people coming to the United States who could then ultimately become U.S. citizens, right? They think about the immigration that the Trump administration wanted from Norway. No, this was not that, right? So they were opposed to that, and they were thinking, okay, how do we stop this? The major goals were to stop people from entering and stop them from seeking asylum. And the best way would be to, if you couldn't stop them physically from entering, was to expel or remove them quickly before they had a chance to seek asylum. I'm not going to go through all the policies. I just want to say that a couple of them I'll note. It really bothered them that so many people demonstrated that they had a credible fear, meaning they had a reasonable possibility of demonstrating asylum. So they tried to find ways to actually undermine the screening. They actually appointed, the screening is done by asylum officers who are professionally trained. They understand refugee law reasonably well. And they decided, Stephen Miller decided, CB, Customs and Border Protection officers should be making some of those decisions. Well, no surprise when a CBP officer's mission is not to protect refugees. Their mission is to ensure that the security of the country is respected, that people who have committed crimes don't come into the country, etc., that people who come into the country have a legal reason to be here, or that they have a right to seek asylum. But they're not the ones who understand what asylum is. So, yes, the rates of approval for credible fear went down tremendously. The second way they tried to do this was to expedite, if you can imagine this, expedite the expedited removal process. If you have questions about this, I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A, but I'm talking about expedited. The expedited process is already just a couple weeks. Let's see if we can make it 1, 2, or 3 days. So, they then tried to demolish the screening. They set up some bans. The first asylum ban was to make people ineligible for asylum if they didn't seek entry at an official border crossing station, which doesn't sound like a bad idea in the sense of, yeah, it would be nice if people just came through the regular ports of entry, if they could. But, of course, they couldn't. And the thing is that, the problem for this particular idea was that Congress had explicitly, and I mean explicitly, provided in the statutory language that a migrant could seek asylum even if they unlawfully crossed the border, because refugees flee in any way they can around the world. They're trying to get to safety, right? That's their goal. Sometimes it's through a port of entry, sometimes it's not. Anyway, even the Supreme Court said you couldn't do that. The current administration, the Biden administration, has adopted that again. It's not gone. There's another, I'm not going to go into any details about the other ban, but Stephen Miller had been looking for something stronger than that. What he was doing was having some effect in lowering the number of people who were coming to the southern border. But the bottom line was there were still people coming. He had been looking for a health care law that he could use. He tried something early on, didn't work. COVID came. I won't go into the details about this, but the bottom line is that using COVID as the explanation, which the statute that was created for this didn't actually authorize, they were able to very quickly expel. I'm talking 96 minutes was the average of an expulsion. Somebody would be picked up by the Border Patrol, 96 minutes later, they were expelled. 2.9 million people that way, actually mostly under the Biden administration. So I have to say that Stephen Miller and the Trump administration was quite successful in what they were trying to achieve. The Biden administration, I'll just say, they did terminate a number of those policies that the Trump administration put into place. They did continue to use the health care laws for some time until recently. They then tried to pivot and create some legal ways for people to come. So there was some really, I think, some real creativity in the administration. They actually figured out a way that large numbers of people who were from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela who were coming to the southern border could enter the United States legally, be sponsored by somebody here, usually a family member here, and come to the United States on an airplane, not at the southern border, right? And up to $30,000 a month. That's been a very popular program. That's working, but it's not going to affect everybody there. There's a lot more to say about the Biden administration and its policies, and I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A, but I want to spend a few minutes, for the few minutes I have left, to talk about how the United States can and I think should respond to the current humanitarian crisis. This is not a movement of people coming for work, principally and pretty much only for that. So the major ways to improve the system. One is to address the root causes. It turns out that 97% of people on our planet choose to stay in their home countries. Now, there are a lot of people who aren't in a great situation in their home countries, but they choose to stay there. And if we wanted to help people stay in their own countries, there are ways to try to help do that. You have to address some of the root causes. We've tried a little of that, trying to create rule of law programs in certain Central American countries with mixed success, but there are ways to try to do that in our region, for sure. Why are so many coming to the United States? Why don't they stop along the way in other countries where they can reach safety? Because they're not reaching safety. Costa Rica is one of the few countries in the region who actually can provide safety. Costa Rica is a small country. It's overwhelmed right now with asylum seekers, Gesundheit. So the United States and Canada, the high-income countries in our region, I think, should assist low- and middle-income countries in figuring out how to provide protection to humanitarian arrivals. Mexico is key in this, but we're not there yet. Mexico hasn't provided enough safety for its own citizens, and so it's not there yet, nor does it have its asylum adjudication system isn't set up to do this yet either. I also think we need to think about the narrative for who's coming and for immigrants in this country, because there's a narrative that is out there in the media and that many Americans are now convinced is the case. And if you think that immigrants are making important contributions to this society, then I think it's important to change the narrative. Even if you only looked at economic contributions, and that is not the only contribution that people from other countries make to our society or have made all these years. The Congressional Budget Office in March just said that immigrant workers are a major factor in the economic growth of the country now and for the next 10 years, and also in addressing the federal debt. Yes. Remember, there have also been a significant portion of the essential workers that we had during the pandemic. And so the narrative needs to be changed. I do think it's important to try to address the fears that some Americans have that make people so worried about the newcomers and why people are coming in such large numbers and in irregular fashion. Coming in a way that will appear chaotic, that can be chaotic, that is chaotic at the southern border, that's not a healthy system. There are better ways to do this. So we should be thinking about using the refugee resettlement program, which is an orderly way to bring refugees to the United States. We do it elsewhere in the world. We could be doing more in the Western Hemisphere. The asylum system itself needs resources. The Congress has never funded enough resources for any administration to actually screen and adjudicate asylum claims. I think there are ways to make those decision-making processes more efficient, similar to the way we do it in the refugee admissions program, where State Department officials are often the ones who are pre-designating groups of people they've identified who are refugees, and they're a group that's on the list. Well, we have a lot of people coming where it's clear they're a persecuted group. That could make the adjudications more efficient. And I think at the end of the day, representation matters. I won't tell you how much it matters, but it's the single most important factor in an immigration court case, both in terms of raising claims and in outcomes. I think we should revisit how the U.S. manages humanitarian arrivals at the border. Customs and Border Protection will always conduct a security check. They need to do that. There's no question about that. They need to know who's coming into the country. Who have they apprehended in between a port of entry? Usually asylum seekers today, by the way, are waiting for them. They want to be picked up and processed. They're not trying to escape from them. That's changed. That's the new reality. I think the United States might be able to learn a bit from another country that handled a large influx of over 1 million Syrian asylum seekers in 2015 and 2016, and that's Germany. Germany has a series of reception centers that they use. It's a much more humane way of dealing with humanitarian arrivals than what we've used, which is detention facilities. I also think civil society can actually play a big role in doing this. So there are a number of ways I think why this can change, and I just want to close with why it's so important for U.S. leadership to be able to do this. What's happening here in our hemisphere is happening around the world. It's a global phenomenon. It's not just here. There's a large increasing number of displaced people globally. Women and children are particularly vulnerable. Forced migration is very destabilizing for all involved. One significant purpose, as I said, of the refugee law system and the treaty system is to create stability. So another government steps in where the previous government failed. The United States is stepping in to protect a refugee where Nicaragua failed, for example, right? Because they persecuted their own citizens. There was a time when the United States spoke with a degree of moral authority based on its actions in this area, rescuing refugees abroad. We brought 3 million people to the United States through our refugee admissions program that the State Department established with congressional statutory approval. We've provided asylum to refugees who somehow managed to reach the United States, but we're failing in the second part of this, the asylum system. And given the global displacement crisis, the U.S. voice, I think, is needed once again, and it's got to start with actions that protect refugees. Thank you. So I'm happy to take all questions that you have, and we'll try to answer them. And there's a mic coming around.
Oh, yeah, I've got a question right here.
Okay, and then we have one up here too. Great.
My question is related to if you have seen any attempt of United States to address the problem of deportation, for example, in Central America, when we can see with deportation increase crime in the countries, and we are actually having more problems to address those problems in those countries in terms they continue being in gangs and they have they lost opportunities there.
So can I ask you to clarify that just a bit in this sense? There was a period of time when the deportations involved not people arriving at the southern border. There were people who were inside the United States, some of whom grew up in the United States and learned many things here in the communities they lived in, and then were deported to, for example, Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, right? And that was one period of time when the United States people had served a sentence for something they had done in the United States, and then they were removed. Today, it's a different population, so I just want to ask you to clarify so I know exactly what you'd like me to talk about with deportations.
Yes, it's because I read a report of U.S. Committee for Refugees, and they were actually studying around how deportation of young male increase specific crimes because they don't have opportunities in terms of when they arrive there.
Oh. Okay, so I don't know about that data. I'll have to look at that report. Look, the problem in those particular countries, which I do think the United States and other actors in the region, not just us, should be trying to help those countries address is, yes, the gangs control a certain part of and the drug cartels control a certain part of the territory, right? And, sometimes people are forced to do things. And people who are deported, what are the opportunities? There are, I don't want to make any broad statement about, without having a study that I've looked carefully at. Yeah, there are challenges in that, but I think the response to that is, number one, trying to address some of those root causes, including helping them create better economic opportunities, right? But you can't, how's the business world going to go into a society when it's not safe enough, right? So you have to create the safety situation first to encourage that. And right now the removals are not coming from inside. They're largely the people who are being sent and removed, deported to those 3 Central American countries and elsewhere are the humanitarian arrivals, right? And it's not only males, but yes, it includes males. So, there's some effort by the administration to do that, but it's, I think we all understand the politics. Politics is all about short-term results, right? That's the pressure. It's not a good pressure. It's really not helping us all as a society or the societies that in our region. And so at some point, somebody's got to think about not just their own administration, but future administrations and how we can build a different hemisphere, if you will. So, sorry I can't say anything more specific about that group. Do we have the
Professor,
mics coming around?
I had a question, and unfortunately my question is not nearly as knowledgeable or meaty as that one. I'm really hung up on the vernacular around this topic, and you explained the nuance between asylum seekers and refugees.
Sure.
But you also seem to use the terms immigrant and migrants somewhat interchangeably.
Yep.
And I don't understand the distinction among those groups of people. And I wonder also if there's a nuance around, legal and illegal or undocumented transport of people across borders. Like, could the first of all, I guess, are there migrants that do come to the United States or seek to come to the United States for reasons other than humanitarian reasons? And what percentage are they in this mix? And could the United States satisfy its, legal and moral and human rights obligations through more formal refugee resettlement programs like you described through Congress? But then what do you do with people streaming across borders to the north and south? I don't know. So there are a couple of different questions in there, but the definitional terms are confusing for me.
Sure, thanks for asking. Obviously, I didn't quite get there, and I'm glad you've asked. So, when I use the term refugee, I'm talking about somebody who's crossed an international border and meets the Refugee Convention and U.S. statutory laws of having a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Basically, that's it. It's a narrow definition, and some do meet it. I mean, my students at the clinic I direct are usually pretty successful with their clients in proving to an immigration judge that that person has met that definition. An asylum seeker is somebody who has not yet been determined to be a refugee. Now, there are 2 ways that you could be a refugee. You could be determined by an adjudicator to be a refugee, or you can actually be a refugee before there's any determination, because either you are somebody who has crossed an international border and has a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of those protected characteristics, or you're not. The adjudication is just the formal way of any government making that a legal finding, and then a legal status follows from that. That's part 1. Is that?
Yep.
Good, okay.
We're clear on that. It's the other terms that I'm not clear.
Okay, so migrants and immigrants. All right. The term immigrant in the United States and in our laws actually refers to a legal immigrant. But we use it both to talk about undocumented immigrants and legal immigrants. So that's where it gets somewhat complex. We have over 1 million lawful permanent residents, green card holders, every year in this country during this century. It was only the pandemic that tamped that down a bit. That's been a steady, and that's because we have our legal immigration system is very highly focused on family. Family was an important value all the time in U.S. immigration law, from the beginning of the restrictions, the 1920s till now. So immigrants, when we talk about them, sometimes we mean the legal immigrants, sometimes we mean both legal and undocumented. So that depends for the context. Migrants. Well, why did President Biden, as vice president, use that term, right? Because he was trying to distinguish between, people in the United States who are immigrants and those people who are arriving as migrants. International migrants may be legal international migrants traveling on a legal visa and with permission to go someplace. They may not be, but they're international migrants because they've crossed an international border. Does that help some? Yeah, it is messy. And I think your point about, so yes, the refugee resettlement and refugee admissions process can be, as I was suggesting, can be used to provide, be used more as a legal avenue to regularize this. Every government in the world wants to have, if they want any immigration and protect refugees, they want to have it in a regular form. Why wouldn't we? We should try to be doing that. That's what the refugee admissions, program is about that the State Department set up. The asylum system, is really about people who, think about it this way, who weren't identified by our government but get here on their own. Sort of like the way most people's ancestors got to the United States, including the people who were here before the Europeans came, right? I mean, that's people migrated. So now we have all these rules. Every country does, since the 1920s when the national origins quota system was put into place by our Congress, because it was there was a great deal of fear of the people who were coming from Poland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, the Eastern European Jews. And they created the quotas. They required visas, and we've had that system ever since. So the question is, how can we try to manage what's going on at the southern border, encourage people to apply in legal ways? Congress has not reformed the legal immigration system since 1990. That is so irresponsible. And I understand we're in a political divide. I get all of that. But that is they have the constitutional authority and responsibility to do that. Nobody else can. The president has limited means. Any president has limited means. This administration has tried to use some of them. So there are a lot of Cubans, Cubans, Haitians, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans who were coming to the southern border. And the administration said, maybe we can use the parole authority, it's a statutory authority, to grant humanitarian parole if they're sponsored by a family member here. Like if they have somebody here. Our legal immigration system has always been grounded in a U.S. sponsor, either a family member or a business. That's our system. We're different from Canada and Australia. Everybody's got their own way of doing it, which is great. Ours is that. So if we could come up with more ways of doing it, we could diminish what's going on at the southern border. Gets really more complicated because then you've got smugglers who like business as is. And who are those smugglers? Well, we have more and more of the drug cartels involved in that. And what does that mean? Why drug cartels? Why do we have drug cartels in this region? Where are all the drugs going? There's so many complexities to try to figure out how do you manage this. And yes, it would be great if CBP, Customs and Border Protection, was really focused on the mission to interdict drugs and other things, right? But so there's some important security issues as to why we should reform the legal immigration system, try try to ensure that people have a safer way of getting here. Sure. Can we have the mic? Oh, you do have it? Sorry.
Oh, no, I have it.
Oh, I apologize.
Okay. I was going to say that you talked about changing the narrative about who's coming to the country and the immigrants that are already in the country. And while I agree, and I think many Americans would agree, how would we do this? And also, do you think it's possible to do this in our current political and social state?
Well, let's start with I think one of the problems is, the anti-immigrant narrative is not only on Fox News. I'm sorry, but it's not. I hear it sometimes from this administration. I hear it from, what are they called? The people who talk about policy issues on TV, right? Sometimes they're experts in some things, but, they're mostly talking about, these issues. And they've picked up some facts here and there, and they don't have, their information's not correct. So I think there are some people you could reach with accurate information about who the immigrants are, what's the best way to receive them. Right now, how long have we had this incredibly low unemployment rate in the United States? There's a lot of hiring that's going on. There are a lot of jobs that aren't being filled. Well, do we want to start thinking about people who can do that sort of work? You basically need Congress to reform that. But in the meantime, the employers are going to hire because that's just how our Congress has not set up a system where it is going to prevent them from hiring, basically. As to convincing people who, some people you would never be able to convince that, immigrants bring a lot of positive value to the country. And I don't want to overstate this. I'm saying, if I look at this in the large view, and I've seen the research on this, yes, on the whole, the results are, the contributions are positive. So the problem is a lot of people are afraid. I once went to a small town in northwest Arkansas, 30,000. Hadn't seen immigrants for a century. And then all of a sudden, the chicken processing factory in Rogers, Arkansas, needed people who would stick with the job and make that factory work. Turned out to be, it was newcomers who were choosing those positions, going to Rogers to fulfill those. Now, the ones who came first were the males. Usually, if they were coming from Central America at that time, this goes back 20 plus years, they were the males. They started, but then they brought their families. So there was some fear in the community about, the single, they looked like they were single males. No, they weren't, they had families. They had no idea that these were people who actually went to church and celebrated, similar religions, but religions that they valued. When they settled in, the leadership in Rogers, Arkansas actually decided this is good for the community. It's good for the business. It's good for our community to stay alive. It's a small rural town, right? And it was also a town where the head of Walmart at that time had some influence, and he actually cared about the newcomers. So with political leadership, you can do things, you can change. And yes, it's not a straight yes, oh, now I'm pro this. It's more of educating people who are open to that. Some people will never be open to that, and that's life. And yes, social media, yeah, it's a challenge. But to me, it shouldn't stop us from trying. We have educational systems. That's one place where we should be doing this. And I just want to make it clear, I'm not talking about, trying to impose ideas on people. I'm talking about what, the research tells us about who's here, what they're doing, what they bring to the community in various ways. And that's always been the situation. Every group that came to the United States from the beginning, the Irish were the first ones who were disliked. They were papists. They were never going to be able to be part of this country. Then the Germans came. Oy, the Germans. Okay, well, the Germans, how were they ever going to adopt our form of government? Benjamin Franklin thought they couldn't. Benjamin Franklin, a really smart guy, right? Yeah. Okay, he thought they couldn't. Well, William Penn disagreed. So, the problems of, the ideas have been there for a while. My feeling is, we need to try harder. So, can you pass the mic? It's largely for, I'm sorry, who's got the mic? Here it comes. Only because they're trying to record this, I believe. It's coming.
Oh, come right here.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you.
So when you compare I wouldn't even call it a system, just our situation right now on treating of immigration and compare it with other rich countries, the Southern Europe, in the whole area of Southern Europe, Greece and Italy, France, Spain, Japan, Australia, South Korea, how do they compare with us? Because you do hear about what's going on in Europe at the boat people, but what about those other countries? And is there any country that we can look to that has a rational, reasonable system of dealing with immigrants? And is there any way that we could perhaps harmonize our way of dealing with immigrants across all of these rich countries? The current issue, The Economist says that 10% of all of the habitations on Earth will be inundated because of global warming. And these are all poor countries.
Yep.
Yeah, India, Bangladesh, places like that. Just what are your thoughts on those questions?
Yeah. Well, you may have noticed that the Europeans in particular have been struggling with this, and they've come up with all sorts of solutions. So, because the movement of people is complex, it's not only people moving because of persecution and not only people moving because of conflict, but people have different reasons. And so I do think that we continue to need to have systems that address why people are leaving their own countries. I think it would be, the Europeans, I will say, one of the things that they do well is they actually, because they didn't want to receive so many immigrants, the continental ones specifically, they actually provide more international development aid to the countries from which they're receiving immigrants. They're doing it because they wanted to help people stay home, right? But, a lot of people would rather stay home. So, and the idea of international development, given the inequities in the world, yes, that's one good vehicle to try to use. But is there any, there's no perfect system, there's no perfect place. The Canadians are in a unique situation. They don't have the southern border that we have, right? And so what I mean by that is that they have not had to make decisions about what to do with very, very large numbers of arrival. By the way, the percentage of foreign-born in Canada, ours is about 14% now, which is about as high as it was, at the highest moment about a century ago. In Canada, it's 20%. In Australia, I think it's 24% or something like that. So the question is, how do we regularize international migration so people can flow more regularly? What we've been able to do is, we've been able to do that when it comes to international business. We've been able to do that with higher skilled people. What we're failing to do this with are people who actually are really needed in many societies and can make a contribution, but those societies have to be open to them. Let's take Japan as an example. Boy, the aging population in Japan, they need immigrants. They're slowly recognizing this, but it's a real cultural challenge, for them. So there's I wish there were, an easy answer to this, but there are reasons that we've had international norms that I still think are valuable. With climate change, we got a long ways to go. It's just beginning, and we're going to have to develop laws. One more question? Okay.
Oh, we have one more. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking to us today. I know that you mentioned briefly about circular migration in regards to Mexican economic migrants a few decades back. And that reminded me of the suspension of the Bracero program in the 1960s.
Yep.
And a few decades later, we saw the effects of that suspension causing a huge influx of in-migration, but a reduction in out-migration. And I was just wondering, would you see a program that involves circular migration for economic migrants, given that the drivers of international migration are mixed? And what I mean by that is that humanitarian issues coincide in many complex ways with economic issues and wanting to find a better place to live and have a better quality of life. So do you see that type of program as being viable in the United States? If so, how would that move through the legislative process, given the volatility of political administrations? And if not, why and what challenges would obstruct that from happening?
So what circular migration meant here in the United States is it was particularly in connection with farm workers, okay? And it was because in Texas and California, farm workers were, at least the growers, said that they were needed. And people were, before the border was more highly regulated, people would, be able to come and then go back home and then come back in the next season. Okay. The challenge with doing that in a liberal democracy is, that can work fine for people who want to continue to do that in some circumstances. It worked during that period, although we didn't have the legal visa system set up to do it. That's what we should be using. That's what actually President George W. Bush had proposed. Now, there are problems, though, with those sorts of temporary worker visas. If they require somebody to remain circular, because life goes on, people meet people, people have families, and they develop roots in communities. What are you going to do then? Even in Germany, I remember visiting in Germany when the Bosnians were asked to go back to Bosnia after they were given temporary protection for 4 years or so. And we met with some German ministers who told us, look, once they've been here for 5 years, the kids should be going to school. They should be becoming part of our society. That was the 1990s. That's not what Europe is saying today. But that's what they were. But let's now look at Germany. Germany stood up and, because of Angela Merkel, decided, okay, we're going to, receive these Syrian refugees. Yeah, there's pushback. But the circular part, in some circumstances it can work. You know where it's working in some ways? In small regions, in the Andean region, for example. There is some circular migration because they're allowing, but they're legal visas that they use. So it's possible to do that. And it's a little harder, when people then develop roots and they're encouraged to stay for other reasons, because only certain businesses are really open for circular migration, if you will. Okay, thank you very much for your tough questions. I appreciate it.